Lady Agatha Marlowe stood near the perimeter of the Marlowe Winter Ball, her fingers curled tightly around a glass of untouched sherry. At 24, she possessed an ethereal, porcelain beauty that seemed almost too fragile for the predatory glitz of the ballroom. Tonight was meant to be the final seal on her future. In a fortnight, she was to wed Lord Ambrose Barron, the golden heir to the Barron fortune. To the Ton, he was the ultimate prize, handsome, wealthy, and utterly devoted. Or so they believed. Agatha's gaze tracked Ambrose across the floor. He leaned toward a young debutante, his laughter a touch too loud, his hand lingering on the small of the girl's back with a familiarity that made Agatha's skin crawl. Beside her, an elderly duchess clicked her tongue in silent judgment. Agatha remained a statue of practiced quietness, though she had heard every whisper of the rot beneath the velvet. Ambrose's mounting gambling debts, his nights spent in low-lit gaming hells, and the rumors that he intended to blame her for fragile nerves for a public split to shield his own reputation from creditors. As the music slowed, Ambrose approached, his smile failing to reach his cold eyes. "My dear Agatha," he drawled, "the heat here is stifling. Shall we step into the conservatory?" Agatha felt the trap closing. She knew he had rehearsed his exit, a calculated ruin meant to leave her a social ghost. "Certainly, Ambrose," she replied, her voice like silk over steel. As they stepped into the shadows, she realized he wasn't just ending an engagement, he was attempting to bury her. But Agatha Marlowe was finished being small. "If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mom said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter." The conservatory doors closed behind them with a whisper that felt like a eulogy. Moonlight filtered through the glass panels, casting silvered shadows across potted palms and exotic orchids that her family had imported at expense of expense. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and something darker, the metallic tang of impending betrayal. Ambrose released her arm the moment they were alone, his theatrical tenderness evaporating like morning frost. He turned to face her, and in the moonlight, his handsome features took on the quality of a beautiful mask with nothing behind it. "Agatha," he began, his voice stripped of its public warmth, "we need to discuss the reality of our arrangement." She said nothing. Years of making herself small had taught her the power of silence, how it could unnerve men who expected tears or pleading. He continued, emboldened by her stillness. "You're aware, I'm sure, of certain financial complications. My investments haven't yielded what was promised. The wedding, as planned, would be imprudent." "Imprudent," Agatha repeated, tasting the word like poison. "Is that what we're calling your losses at the Serpent's Den? I hear you wagered my dowry on a single hand of cards." His jaw tightened. She'd surprised him, and men like Ambrose despised surprises from women they deemed controllable. "You've been listening to gossip," he said, his voice hardening. "This is precisely why this won't work. You're too delicate for the realities of marriage. Too prone to hysteria." Hysteria. She let the word hang between them. The affliction that requires no proof and absolves you of all blame. Ambrose's mask cracked further. "The announcement will be made tomorrow. I'll ensure everyone knows the break was necessary for your health. You'll retire to the country for your nerves, and in time, perhaps, some country squire will overlook your—" "Ruin?" Agatha supplied. the ruin you're manufacturing as we speak?" He stepped closer, and she caught the smell of expensive cologne mixed with something sour. Fear, perhaps, or the desperation of a man whose creditors were circling. "I'm being merciful, Agatha. I could destroy you completely. One word about your instability, your melancholia, your unsuitability for society. Who would question me?" In that moment, something crystallized in Agatha's chest. It wasn't anger, though anger was there. It wasn't even hurt, though that old wound throbbed. It was clarity, cold and sharp as winter steel. "No one would question you," she said quietly, "and that's precisely why I won't beg you to reconsider." She turned toward the door, and his hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "Where do you think you're going?" "Back to the ballroom," she said, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that made him release her. "Let it be witnessed. Let them all see the man who ruins women to save himself." Agatha pushed through the conservatory doors and stepped back into the ballroom. The orchestra was playing a waltz, the chandelier's 1,000 crystals casting fractured light across the dance floor. For a moment, no one noticed her return. Then they did. The whispers started like a wind through dry leaves. Heads turned. Fans snapped open to hide mouths that shaped her name like a curse. She saw her mother's stricken face across the room, her father's confusion morphing into understanding and then devastation. Ambrose emerged behind her, and she heard him say to the nearest cluster of guests, his voice pitched to carry, "Forgive me, the evening has been too much for Lady Agatha's constitution. She's unwell." Before we go further, please take a second to subscribe to this channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Agatha didn't run. She didn't weep. She simply began to walk. Her path cut directly through the center of the ballroom, through the dancers who parted like a sea before a plague ship. Each step was measured, her spine straight, her head high. She would not scurry away like a shamed creature. She would not give them that satisfaction. The Duchess of Pemberton, an old friend of her mother's, turned her back as Agatha passed. Lord Hastings, who had once called her the jewel of the season, suddenly found his champagne glass fascinating. Even the débutantes, those fresh-faced girls who had looked to her as an ideal just hours ago, now regarded her with a mixture of pity and relief. Relief that they were not the one being cast out. Only one person didn't look away. Standing near the entrance, a figure she'd almost forgotten, Benedict Berkeley, the Duke of Knox. He was a man who rarely attended London social events, preferring his northern estates to the artifice of the ton. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that refused to be tamed by fashion and eyes that seemed to see through pretense to the bone beneath. Their gazes met, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, or a memory of a conversation at another ball years ago when he'd warned her that Ambrose Barron was a man who collected beautiful things only to break them. She dismissed him then. She thought him presumptuous, interfering. Now, as she passed him, he gave her the smallest nod. Not pity, not judgment, acknowledgement. It was the kindest gesture she'd received all night. The night air hit her like a physical blow. After the stifling heat of the ballroom, the December cold was sharp enough to steal breath. Agatha stood on the front steps of Marlowe House, watching the fog roll through Mayfair's gaslit streets like a living thing. Behind her, the ball continued. The music played on. Her ruin was already being digested, transformed into the latest scandal to be served with morning tea. By dawn, every household in London would know that Lady Agatha Marlowe had succumbed to her nerves, had proven herself unfit for marriage to the estimable Lord Baron. She laughed, a bitter sound that the fog swallowed. The estimable Lord Baron who couldn't pay his tailor, the devoted fiancé who'd already chosen her replacement before he'd ended their engagement. She began to walk. She had no plan, no destination. Her family's townhouse was 3 streets away, but she couldn't face her mother's tears or her father's quiet disappointment. Not yet. Not while her rage was still this raw. The fog thickened as she walked, muffling the sounds of the city. Her thin evening slippers were poor protection against the cobblestones, but she welcomed the discomfort. It grounded her, kept her from floating away into the numbness that threatened at the edges of her consciousness. 3 years. She'd given Ambrose 3 years of her life. She'd molded herself to his preferences, dimmed her sharp tongue to suit his need for a decorative, undemanding wife. She'd made herself small and smaller still until she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to take up space. And for what? To be discarded the moment he needed a scapegoat for his own failures? The memory of Benedict's warning rose unbidden. They'd been at the Somerset ball, and she'd just accepted Ambrose's proposal. Benedict had asked her to dance, and in the privacy of the waltz, he'd said, "Baron is a wolf in silk, Lady Agatha. He'll devour you and blame you for the blood on his teeth." She was offended. She'd called him ungentlemanly for speaking against a fellow peer. She ended the dance early and avoided him for the rest of the season. She'd been such a fool. The street narrowed as Agatha walked, the fine houses giving way to the spaces between, the mews where servants lived, the shadowed alleys where London's night business was conducted. She should have been afraid. A woman alone at night was asking for tragedy. But she'd already been ruined. What else could happen to her? The answer came in the form of thunder, not weather. Hoofbeats, the rapid, urgent drumming of horses driven hard through fog. Agatha turned just as a massive coach materialized from the mist, its black lacquer gleaming wetly in the gaslight. The driver hauled on the reins, and the horses reared, their breath steaming in the cold air. The coach swerved, coming to a halt mere inches from where Agatha had frozen against a stone wall. Her heart hammered in her chest, her earlier numbness shattered by pure animal fear. The door swung open before the coach had fully stopped. "Get in." The voice was deep, commanding, and achingly familiar. Benedict Berkeley leaned out, his dark coat blending with the shadows, his face half hidden but for the intensity of his gaze. "Your Grace," Agatha managed, her voice shakier than she'd like, "I'm quite capable of—" "Walking home alone through London's worst streets in evening dress?" he interrupted. "Yes, I can see that. Get in, Lady Agatha. This isn't a request." "I don't take orders from—" "Then consider it a plea from a man who's watched you make yourself invisible for 3 years and refuses to watch you disappear entirely." His voice softened just slightly. "Please. If you believe people deserve protection, not control, hit that subscribe button. People like Ambrose won't, and you need to hear what she did about it." Agatha stared at the open door, at the darkness within that somehow seemed less threatening than the world she'd just left behind. She thought of her family's townhouse, where pity would be waiting. She thought of tomorrow's scandal sheets, of the endless whispers that would follow her for years. And she thought of Benedict's words, "If you're to be ruined in my company." She climbed into the coach. The interior was unexpectedly warm, heated by brass foot warmers. Agatha sank into the velvet seat as the door closed behind her, sealing them in together. The coach lurched into motion, and she gripped the handhold to steady herself. Benedict sat across from her, his long legs taking up most of the space between them. In the close confines, she could see him more clearly, the sharp line of his jaw, the weariness around his eyes that spoke of a man who'd traveled hard to be here. "You left Knox Manor for a ball you despise," she said. It wasn't a question. "I left Knox Manor," he corrected, "because I received word that Ambrose Barron had invited creditors to the Marlowe ball. I knew what he planned to do." "And you thought to stop it?" Bitterness crept into her voice. "A bit late for heroics, Your Grace." "I thought," he said evenly, "to be there, so that when you walked out, and I knew you would walk out, you wouldn't be entirely alone." The simplicity of it stole her breath. Not rescue, not salvation, just presence. "Where are we going?" she asked. "North, to Knox Manor." "You're abducting me?" She should have been alarmed, but instead found herself almost amused. "I'm offering you sanctuary," Benedict said, "a place to recover before you decide what comes next. Your family will be informed by morning. They'll understand." "Will they? Or will this just add scandal upon scandal?" "Probably," he admitted, "but here's what I've learned about scandal, Lady Agatha. It only has power if you fear it. Let them talk. Let them say the ruined Lady Marlowe ran off with the hermit duke. Let them make it as sordid as they like. It changes nothing about who you actually are." Agatha looked at him, really looked at him. He'd always been handsome in a rough, unpolished way that defied London standards. Too tall, too broad, too direct. He dressed well, but without vanity, as if clothing was simply armor against the weather, rather than a statement of worth. "Why?" Agatha asked. "Why do you care what happens to me?" He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because I've watched you make yourself smaller and smaller, trying to fit into Ambrose Barron's idea of a perfect wife. And because I remember the woman you were before him, the one who argued politics at dinner parties, who laughed too loud, who took up space without apology. I'd like to see her again." They traveled through the night, stopping only to change horses. Agatha drifted in and out of sleep, lulled by the coach's rhythmic swaying and the knowledge that for the first time in years she didn't have to perform for anyone. Dawn broke cold and clear as they crested a hill, and Agatha saw Knox Manor for the first time. It wasn't like the delicate estates around London with their manicured gardens and Palladian facades. Knox Manor was a fortress, all dark stone and honest angles, built to withstand northern winters and the weight of centuries. It sat atop a wind-swept moor, surrounded by ancient oaks that had probably stood when the conquest was still a fresh wound. "It's not fashionable," Benedict said, watching her reaction. "It's honest," Agatha replied. "There's no pretense here." "No," he agreed. "Everything at Knox is what it appears to be." The coach rattled through iron gates and into a courtyard where servants were already gathering, clearly having received word of their master's arrival. An elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, Benedict introduced her, welcomed Agatha without a trace of judgment, simply showing her to a suite of rooms overlooking the moors. "Rest," Benedict told her. "We'll talk when you're ready." But Agatha found she couldn't rest. The rooms were comfortable, a bedroom, a sitting room, a private bath, but her mind was too active. She bathed, changed into the simple dress Mrs. Finch had provided, and found herself wandering the corridors of Knox Manor. The house was a revelation, Unlike London's showpiece estates, Knox felt lived in. There were books scattered on tables, half-finished correspondence on desks, muddy boots by doorways. It was a home, not a museum. She found Benedict in the library, standing before a fire that roared in a massive stone hearth. He'd changed out of his formal clothes into country wear, wool trousers, a simple shirt, no cravat. He looked more himself than she'd ever seen him in London. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, without turning. "Too many thoughts," she admitted, moving to stand beside him. "Your Grace." "Benedict," he interrupted. "If we're going to be co-conspirators in scandal, we should probably use Christian names." "Benedict, then." She tested the name, found it fit oddly well in her mouth. "Why did you really bring me here?"
Benedict turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. Not desire exactly, but something deeper, recognition. "I bought Ambrose's debts," he said simply. Agatha stared. "What?" "3 months ago, when his creditors started circling, I bought every note, every marker. He owes me almost everything." "But why?" "Because I thought if I controlled his finances, I could control his behavior. I could keep him from destroying you." Benedict's laugh was harsh. "Foolish, I know. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. You can't protect someone who hasn't chosen to save themselves." Agatha's mind reeled. "You've been, what, watching over me?" "Unsuccessfully, it seems." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I've watched you dim yourself for him. I've watched you apologize for taking up space, for having opinions, for being brilliant. And I've hated myself for not saying anything. Because you didn't ask for my protection. You didn't want my interference." "At the Somerset ball," Agatha said slowly, "when you warned me about him?" "You were furious with me, and rightfully so. It wasn't my place." He met her eyes. "But I couldn't watch anymore, Agatha. I couldn't watch him extinguish everything that made you extraordinary." "So you've been my, what, secret guardian?" "Your creditor," he corrected wryly. "Ambrose can't marry anyone else, can't make another move in society without my permission. I've made sure of that." Agatha should have been angry at the presumption. She should have felt manipulated, controlled. But instead, she felt something else entirely. The weight of truly being seen by someone who asked nothing in return. "I don't need a guardian," she said quietly. "I know. You never did. You needed someone to step out of your way long enough for you to remember your own strength." They stood in silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the moor stretched endlessly, wild and uncontained. Nothing like London's careful gardens. "What happens now?" Agatha finally asked. "That depends entirely on you." Benedict moved to a desk, pulled out a leather portfolio. "These are Ambrose's debt notes. They're yours if you want them. You can destroy him if that's what you choose. Or you can walk away and let him destroy himself, which he will eventually." Agatha took the portfolio, felt the weight of vengeance in her hands. It would be so easy. One word from her and Ambrose would be finished. But she found she didn't want to carry him anymore. Not his debts, not his reputation, not even his destruction. "Burn them," she said. Benedict's eyebrows rose. "Agatha." "Burn them," she repeated. "I don't want his ruin on my conscience. Let him live with the consequences of his own choices. I'm done carrying the weight of his failures." Benedict studied her for a long moment, then did exactly as she asked. The debt notes caught fire, curling into ash that rose up the chimney. Years of Ambrose's mistakes turned to smoke. "What will you do?" Benedict asked. "Return to London? Your family will welcome you back, scandal or no." Agatha looked at him, this man who'd bought debts to protect her, who'd driven through the night to offer sanctuary, who'd asked nothing except that she remember herself. "I could return," she said slowly. "I could weather the scandal eventually, find some country squire willing to overlook my ruined reputation. I could make myself small again, acceptable, safe. Or," Benedict's voice was carefully neutral, "or I could stay." The words felt dangerous, thrilling. "Here, where people say what they mean and houses are built to last rather than to impress, where I don't have to apologize for taking up space." Something blazed in Benedict's eyes. Hope, maybe, or relief. The scandal would be considerable. "I'm already ruined," Agatha pointed out. "Might as well be ruined thoroughly. The Ton would never accept it. An engagement broken one night, a new attachment formed the next. They'd call you fickle at best, a schemer at worst." "Let them." Agatha moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes. "I'm tired of living for their acceptance, Benedict. I'm tired of making myself palatable." "Then don't," he said roughly. "Stay. Not because it's proper or acceptable, but because you want to. Stay and argue with me about politics. Stay and ride across the moors without a chaperone. Stay and take up every inch of space you were always meant to occupy. And what would you want in return? The truth?" Benedict reached for her hand, his touch careful, asking permission. "Everything. Your anger, your brilliance, your sharp tongue, all the parts of you that you've been taught to hide. I want the woman who walked across that ballroom with her head high, who climbed into a stranger's coach because she refused to be defeated. I want you, Agatha, not some diminished version. You." Agatha felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but blooming. "That's rather a lot to offer someone you barely know. I've known you for 3 years. I've watched you survive. That's more telling than 100 polite conversations." The special license arrived within a week. Benedict had connections, dukes generally did, and the Archbishop of Canterbury had owed him a favor. The marriage was conducted in the small Norman chapel on Knox Manor's grounds, witnessed by Mrs. Finch and 3 local farmers who were more interested in the tea afterward than the scandal. Agatha's family arrived the day after the ceremony. Her mother wept, though whether from relief or dismay was unclear, and her father spent an hour in Benedict's study, emerging with a grudging respect for the Duke, who'd married her daughter without asking permission. "He loves you," her father said simply, as they walked the moor together. "I don't understand it. You've had barely a courtship, but he loves you in a way Barron never did. He sees you." The letter from Ambrose arrived 2 weeks later, full of threats and accusations. Benedict read it aloud over breakfast, and they laughed together at the absurdity of a man who'd thrown away gold complaining when someone else claimed it. "He says I bewitched you," Benedict reported. "How flattering. I've never bewitched anyone before," Agatha replied. "You rather have, though." Benedict set the letter aside. "From the moment I saw you at the Somerset ball, arguing with Lord Pemberton about the Reform Acts, you were magnificent." "I was too loud," Agatha said, echoing the criticism she'd heard 1,000 times. "You were alive." Benedict reached across the table, took her hand. "Don't ever apologize for that again." News of their marriage reached London like a bomb. The scandal sheets had a field day. The ruined Lady Marlowe and the hermit Duke, married within weeks of her broken engagement. Society matrons clutched their pearls. Debutantes whispered behind fans. And Agatha discovered she didn't care. She wrote to her former friends, the ones who'd turned their backs that night at the Marlowe ball, not to explain or apologize, but simply to tell them she was happy. Some wrote back with cautious congratulations. Others maintained their silence. It didn't matter anymore.
Winter deepened on the moors. Agatha learned to ride, really ride, not the delicate side saddle trotting considered proper for ladies. She learned to walk for miles without fainting, to argue without apologizing, to laugh without covering her mouth. She learned what it felt like to be loved not despite her sharp edges, but because of them. If you watched or listened up to this point, comment the country you're watching this from. Represent your country. On a morning 6 months after their marriage, Agatha stood in Knox Manor's library, reading a letter from her mother. The town had moved on to fresher scandals. Ambrose had fled to the continent, chased by creditors Benedict had strategically released from their agreements. Life, it seemed, continued, whether or not one was ruined. Benedict entered, bringing the scent of cold air and horses. "Riding?" he asked. "In a moment." Agatha set the letter aside. "I was just thinking about that night, the Marlowe ball. Regrets? None." She moved into his arms, felt them close around her like the fortress walls of Knox itself, strong, honest, immovable. "I was thinking about how I walked out of that ballroom expecting nothing, no rescue, no redemption, just ending. And instead your coach blocked my path." She looked up at him, this man who'd stood in her way not to trap her, but to give her a choice. "Thank you, Benedict, for not letting me disappear. You could never disappear. You're too much yourself for that. I just reminded you of it." They stood together as morning light filled the library. Two people who'd found each other not in spite of scandal, but because of it. Agatha had been ruined that night at the Marlowe ball, ruined in society's eyes, perhaps. But she'd also been remade, not into something smaller or more acceptable, but into the fullest version of herself. The woman who'd walked through the fog alone had found her way to a fortress built of honesty, where she could finally take up all the space she'd been meant to occupy. And if the town whispered about the ruined Lady Marlowe who'd become the Duchess of Knox, let them whisper. Agatha Marlowe Berkeley had learned that some ruins were foundations for something far stronger than what had stood before. She'd walked away from one life and into another, and the coach that had blocked her path delivered her exactly where she belonged, not to safety, but the truth. And that, she discovered, was worth every scandal, every whisper, every moment of uncertainty. In the wild, wind-swept north, far from London's glittering judgment, Agatha had found what she'd been searching for all along. Not a man to complete her, but the freedom to be completely herself. And that was the best revenge of all.